The process of natural selection was Darwin's major brainchild. That is, that nature can select for certain traits so that certain traits survive events and those traits are passed on to the offspring. By passing on those traits, the population then begins to change. And that's the idea of natural selection. So there's four basic principles to how natural selection works. But to understand, we need to understand a little bit about allele frequency and some things about genetics. First, an allele is either of two forms of a gene for a trait. So in this case, we have an allele for fur color. The fur color could be black or the fur color could be brown. If the two genes pair together and they are for the black trait, then the fur color of the mouse is black. If the two genes pair together and they are for the brown trait, then the mouse is brown. If there's a black allele and a brown allele together, the dominant trait will show up. In this case, that will be black. The dominant allele shows up. So a gene pool then is just all the alleles. So remember, each individual has two of these alleles. Sometimes the two are brown, sometimes the two are black, sometimes it's one of each. But we're looking at all of them together. Now, if there is a condition where it's better to have the black fur, then the population is going to start losing the brown alleles. Why? Because the mice that are carrying the brown alleles are going to be eliminated. Either the predator gets them or the disease or whatever it is. If it is more advantageous to have the brown alleles, then the black ones will start getting eliminated from the gene pool. That is, as the black mice are dying and not reproducing, the brown mice are passing on their genes and the frequency of the brown allele begins to increase. And that's the idea of natural selection. So let's look at these four principles then. The first principle is that there's some variation in the population. In the case we looked at, we have mice with brown fur, we have the mice with the black fur. There's also an importance that the trait can be passed on, because if it can't be passed on, then it doesn't do any good in the population. The third is that there's some selection pressure. Something happens, a shortage of food, a disease, a competition, whatever it is, there's some kind of selection pressure. And then those that have an adaptation that they're able to pass on that helps them survive, pass on that adaptation, and the population begins to change. So let's see if we can look at some examples and see how this might play out. So first we have some giraffes. Notice in the first picture, there is some variation in the population. Some giraffes have long necks, some short, some medium, but there's variation within that population. A second then, those variations, the genes for neck length, have to be able to be passed on to the offspring. All right, third, we're going to have some selection pressure. So let's say it's a drought, or let's say there's a scarcity in food. The giraffes with long necks can reach the top of trees, reach the bottom of trees, reach the middle of the trees, so they have an adaptation that enables them to survive, pass on that gene when they reproduce, so that the population begins to look more like they have longer necks. And that's just because the frequency of the longer neck allele has increased. The giraffes that can't reach the upper branches, they don't survive because they starve to death, so they don't pass their short gene on, and the population begins to change from having lots of variety to having giraffes with longer necks. So that favorable trait is beneficial to the population of the giraffes. So again, just recognize that this natural selection is changing the populations. The frequency of that allele in the population is rising, and so the population changes. It doesn't affect an individual. All right? Individuals contribute to the population, but it's not acting specifically on one mouse, but rather the population of mice. So here's another example of selection pressure. If the seeds on an island are large, then which beak is going to be best suited, like which adaptation is going to be best suited to feed on those large seeds so that that individual can survive and reproduce, pass on that trait to the offspring, and so the population of the birds begins to have larger beak sizes. Natural selection then can have like different types of effects depending on which type of trait is favorable under that kind of selection pressure. So if you look at this top graph, we see that there's variation in a population. All right, so some are light colored, some are dark colored, some are medium colored. Sometimes the way that the selection pressure works is that it's better to have either the light color or the dark color. In this case, it's directional selection because the pressure is driving the population in a direction, either darker fur or lighter fur. Other times, it's better to have the dark or the light, but not the medium color fur. So it's not one or the other, it's both extremes are better. So that's called diversifying selection, or sometimes disruptive selection. So disruptive or diversifying selection means the same thing. But there are other cases where the extremes are not favorable. So those individuals are not surviving to reproduce. It's the one with the medium color fur that survives best to reproduce. In that case, it's called stabilizing selection because the pressure is driving the genes, the favorable genes, to be the ones that are in the middle. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit better this concept of natural selection and how it works.